So, signed on the anniversary of Rerum Novarum, Magnifica Humanitas is concerned with many new things, as we've just been hearing. But in this contribution to our discussions today, I do indeed want to focus on the dignity of work and labor, a perennial theme in social encyclicals, which arises again in this document in the age of new technologies, new things that risk harm and exclusion to the worker. What will become increasingly clear through my paper is the analysis arising from Magnifica Humanitas is operating through three interweaving principles. These will be familiar terms from the papers we've already had: freedom, responsibility, and fidelity of the human person. Work itself is valued in the encyclical as the site or a site in which we fulfill and recognize these capacities. Threats to decent work today are the consequence of new forms of domination and subjugation entangled with technology, ownership, and power, and which threaten those possibilities to live freely, responsibly, and faithfully. To begin, I want to give, as short as possible, a summary of the landscape of Catholic social teaching on work and labor, into which Magnifica Humanitas is speaking, and which the encyclical itself reconstructs, as we've already heard in some of its early chapters. So Catholic social teaching on work has built a vision of work through successive generations of writing, reaffirmed in this new encyclical. And it has, I suggest, three distinctive features. First, it is an activity that supports the full development of the human person. Work is for humans in our continued fulfillment of who we are each supposed to be. Quadragesimo Anno would describe this in terms of humanity being born to labor as the bird to fly, which might sound a bit depressing, but in fact, work, like the flight of birds, has to be learned and becomes how we move through the world. It's a necessity for earning one's daily bread, but beyond that is part of how we fully cultivate ourselves, develop our abilities, and find happiness. Yes, work can be toilsome, but in this vision, the human person is prized as a site of initiative and decision. A conscious and free subject is how Laborum Exercens puts it. That is to say, a subject that decides about himself or themselves. So work is not only for necessity, but for the worker with needs, desires, hopes, and plans. Secondly, through this self-development, work is an activity that takes us outside of ourselves and into relationships with others. We work with others, and this is not just a feature of service work, all sorts of work: capital, technology, service provision, land, property, the database, the CRM, Zoom, the workplace policy, even the dreaded spreadsheet. These are mediums. They mediate human relationship and working relationship, and are themselves also produced through work. Work requires us to engage with others in the context of interdependence, both in concrete encounters and through social institutions. Thirdly, then, as this account is already beginning to make clear, work is part of our participation in the wider life of our communities and societies. In taking us out of ourselves, we become actively part of the wider community, contributing and receiving in mutuality. Laborum Exercens opened with a blessing, which calls work the mark of a person operating in a community of persons. Work in this way is a way for the person to be admitted into the life of the community, a form of participation, a way of becoming alive to our shared responsibilities. That encyclical, Laborum Exercens, redeveloped this all the more strongly when it called society the great historical and social incarnation of the work of all generations. I want to conclude this really brief overview by adding that all of this is the case whether this is paid work or unpaid work. And by unpaid work, we can think of public volunteering, but also home and caring and other forms of domestic roles. While the formal CST documents have not historically been strong on the full range of concerns of working women in the home and beyond, the high value that is placed on caring and domestic work as politically significant is a present thread in the tradition to value. Altogether then, CST has long placed a high value on work itself as a source and vector of the fulfillment and recognition of dignity. And in response to that analysis has consistently called for all sorts of responses of justice, fair pay, freedom to associate and negotiate collectively through labour associations, where the working conditions are set up to ensure this kind of enabling. So it takes this optative, hopeful vision of what work can be, and then insists on attention to the injustices that are preventing work from fulfilling those possibilities. This is the developed landscape of Catholic social teaching on the nature and meaning of work in which Magnifica Humanitas appears. The major contribution that I think the encyclical makes to this particular vision is these three threads that I have mentioned and that are in my title: freedom, responsibility, and fidelity. And the grandeur of humanity in the title of the encyclical, I think, is found in this character of the human person. This is the nature expressed and fulfilled in the structures of work that I have just been suggesting. To fully develop, we need to have freedom, to make choices in freedom. To work with others calls us to responsibility and continues that self-development. To participate through work and labour in the life of the community renders us as public actors, where we may be judged on keeping our promises, judged on our faithfulness to who we promise each other to be and how we'll contribute. Very briefly then, further on these three features of the human person as they run through the encyclical. Freedom appears very frequently in this encyclical. It struck me as much more present explicitly in this encyclical than in others. And it's there in the characterization of the foundation, the nature of dignity, from which the other principles of CST arise. And in many of the other themes about technology that Sam has been picking up on and that we've already heard from Austin as well. When it turns to consider freedom of the worker, the encyclical calls us back to laborem exercens. Through work, human beings bring their freedom, creativity, and capacity for cooperation into play, contributing to the cultural and moral elevation of society. Work as a medium here of political life. Consequently, then, responsibility is inseparable from this vision of human person. And here the city of Nehemiah perhaps gives us a sense of that, because that is a narrative that calls on cooperation and collaboration in the building of a shared political life. And it's explicit in the encyclical, right? The shared responsibility of all, men, women, priests, artisans, heads of households, and young people all play a part. The third theme of fidelity is perhaps less visible in the text of the document. It's not a term that appears as frequently, but it seems to me that it names a reflexive move that makes visible what freedom and responsibility really mean. Fidelity is a capacity that is a form of taking accountability for ourselves in public. For example, sticking to our promises or acting with integrity in relation to our stated principles. So both what I promise and that I do what I promise is part of what fidelity means when it's read in this political theological sense. It's also named as part of what the AI cannot do as it happens. We grow over time through choices, mistakes, forgiveness, and fidelity. Now, these three threads, I suggest, offer an enriched reading of the worker, of people working, who can either be harmed or enabled through the kind of work that is asked of them. And that, I think, is the renewed vision of what work is for and how we should be working. Into that landscape, there are two further major and urgent contributions that the encyclical makes. One is naming the risks and threats to work in this age of AI and other digital technologies. And the second is revisiting and sharpening how decent work itself can be better enabled through protections and processes now and in this moment. And that's what I'm going to give the rest of this paper to, are these 2 points. So the threats that Magnifica Humanitas outlines are consequent to new forms of digital technology, including but not limited to AI. In some ways, these new things represent old problems, but newly intensified, accelerated, and amplified through the deployment of digital technologies. Some are new forms of harm carried by those technologies themselves. So firstly then, new kinds of digital jobs. And the examples given in the encyclical include data labeling, model training, content moderation. This is work that is in and of itself potentially degrading, potentially causing moral harm to the self. So for example, constantly having to moderate images of sexual violence or discourses of racist hate, for example. While much has been made of the impact of AI and digital technologies on employment levels, of jobs being replaced, and the prospect of that unemployment is real and also a concern in this encyclical, it also insists that these technologies can hide labor. AIs are not developed in an immaterial network. They are developed through concrete processes conducted by workers. So the technology can itself be the product of unjust and harmful labor, unseen in the glossy final innovation on the desktop. There's relatedly also the intensification of older industries as well, like resource extraction in the mining of the minerals from which the technologies are built and run. These are industries characterized by poor safety, serious environmental harm, and harm also to moral integrity through violence and cartel-like ownership. And finally, here I would add the encyclical's emphatic concern for the way that digital technology has accelerated and intensified human trafficking. Not as a purely international concern, that's often what we think of with trafficking, but also within regions as well, as traffickers move people from flat to flat while controlling their online profiles, their so-called sex work, and their incomes. Second, there is how we work and the cultural expectations that technology can introduce. So increasing pressure on using AI agents to do work while you're asleep, for example, in certain technological industries, accelerating a scenario of total work. There's the threat of new forms of automation, with that spectre again of large-scale unemployment, but also reshaping work into rigid and repetitive labor. Within jobs, we see automated surveillance to the point of intense dehumanization. So delivery drivers being penalized for singing along to songs on the radio because it registers to the camera in their cab as distracted driving. Or technology that monitors workers' location in order to limit breaks and bathroom use and so on. Other restructuring of the labor market more broadly results in increasing job insecurity, consequent career fragmentation, disempowering workers to make plans for their own lives in reliable ways, or to meaningfully negotiate with their employers. Even de-skilling workers as they experience automated systems coming online and turning them into robot maintenance people instead of care workers, for example. The encyclical adds to this manifestations of inequity, such as unequal access to work opportunities because of digital poverty or digital illiteracy, and the lack of transparency in employment decisions through LLM analysis of job applications or promotion applications and so on. Represented here too in the encyclical are ancient injustices returning: unfair wages, indecent working conditions, the threat of political and social exclusion through unemployment, unjust norms, or missing regulation, and the fruits of labor: patents, algorithms, digital platforms, as we've just been hearing, in the grip of very few, very powerful individuals. What I suggest we see across these two categories, work that fails to be decent work and working conditions that fail to respect the dignity of the worker, are ultimately the erosion of our freedom, our capacity for responsibility, and the expression of that in our accountability and fidelity to each other. The analysis that Magnifica Humanitas ultimately offers of this state of affairs is that the underlying logic of technological advancement urgently calls for ethical discernment. And we've heard this from both our speakers already, a techno-logic of efficiency dehumanizing into a logic of exploitation and commodification. I think the encyclical is absolutely right to attend to new forms of slavery and relationships of subordination akin to slavery that arise from this failure of ethical thinking. From this perspective, humans end up being reduced to a means of achieving results, it says, a resource to be used and exploited, no longer recognized as a proper end in themselves. This is a commodification of persons that can even affect the collective imagination, it says. Bleak. But the encyclical is ready for this dip in mood. A subtle temptation may emerge, it suggests, namely the thought that the problems are too big and we are too small, and that our choices therefore cannot make a difference. This is a polite form of resignation, often disguised as realism. We might add here as well another R word, the meaningfulness of resistance. The encyclical crystallizes a series of concrete suggestions for how to respond to this situation, this large and complex situation, at the large-scale level. So continuous training and accessible support for career transitions, for example, inclusive concepts of growth, social criteria for innovation that attend to the quality and dignity of work, metrics for development that attend to inequalities of access, where action is informed by plans for investment and taxation and oversight, and most fundamentally, rethinking the nature of work. Still, if we hear this list, we may think that our job is limited to the praying and the hoping with which the encyclical also concludes. And of course, on one hand, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that. This is how we replenish our collective imagination. But on the other hand, the encyclical is summoning all sorts of people and groups to take action and to collaborate. It addresses states, agencies, regulators, civil society groups, labor unions, business leaders and owners, all workers. It asks for new forms of collaboration. So I wanted to conclude with some examples of things going on just here in the UK that seem to me to answer some of these larger calls as a way to get a sense and a purchase on activity ongoing for us to then consider how our work might fit in as well. So for labor unions and associations, the encyclical asks that they be open to emerging forms of labor. So we can think of gig economy examples and GMB taking up the cause of Uber drivers working towards employment status rather than gig status. In the corporate sphere, on criteria on quality and dignity of work, CCLA, which is an investment fund for churches, charities, and local authorities, have been developing investigation and benchmarks to assess UK-listed companies on the steps they are taking to eradicate modern slavery in their operations and supply chains. There are charities throughout our sector who are focusing on this as well. Catholic Social Action Network and Women at the Well, the charity that I volunteer with, which is focusing in particular on sexual exploitation. For calls on regulation and employment protection, we can look to organizations like the Institute for the Future of Work, which is pursuing all sorts of research, like the difference a person-centered HR approach can make in a company that is bringing on AI. There is good and responsible activity ongoing across a range of sectors that I think resonates with this encyclical's call. For our part, you will know best how your own particular role or organisation is positioned to be part of that. And crucially, the encyclical is not going to tell you what that is. Instead, it will consistently remind us that we are each responsible and we are each free. Each of us is a site of initiative who can act in the world. The task of being human together, to which this whole encyclical is ultimately directed, is built through fulfilling our promises of who we tell the world that we are, by having integrity in our analysis and our action. And so we recall again that quotation that Austin offered us too. The civilization of love will not arise from a single or spectacular gesture, but from the sum total of small and steadfast acts of fidelity that serve as a bulwark against dehumanization. Thank you.